my name is Nick, and today I'm going to be doing a fly tying tutorial for you. The fly that we're going to be tying is called, unofficially, a fat butt, and here it is. Officially, it's a Caddis emerger. I've been fishing this fly for the last about 30 years since I first tied it, and it's been my #1 top producing fly of all time. That's what I call it. So today I'd like to show you how to tie it jig style for Euro nymph fishing. I'd like to start by showing you the different materials we're going to use and roughly the order that we're going to use them. So let's get this out of here. And let's start with the first part. First material we're going to use is an Antron yarn. This is a fine Antron knitting yarn that I bought a long time ago. It's no longer available, but you can use any fine Antron yarn or dubbing for this. This happens to be a light pink, but cream and white works as well. Next, we're going to use a vernal. This vernal is a small vernal, which I dye in an earthworm color, but you can use it in any color that your local caddis flies are in the rivers around you. Next, we're going to use a partridge feather. So this is just a slate partridge feather. We're going to build a collar out of this. We're also going to use some peacock herl to build a head, and we're going to use a pheasant tail to build some antenna. And those are the materials that we're going to be using largely. I will also show you what hook we're going to be using. This is a Hannock 400 BL jig style hook. You can use any type of jig style hook that you like best. Today we're going to be tying it in a size 16 with a 2.8 millimeter gold bead. Some of the tools I'll be using are specialized, so I'd like to show you those up front. This is called CDC multi-tool, which is what we're going to use to build the soft hackle around the fly. Also, I like to use a Stoneflow dubbing twister, which you can conveniently use with one hand. And also we're going to use a regular dubbing hook. You can use whichever hook is best for you. I don't even remember who makes this or what it's called. I've had it for so long, but it works great for me. So those are mostly the tools and the materials we're going to be using. We'll set up the first hook in the vise. Get it nice and level. Put your vise where it needs to. Put your gold bead. Get the gold bead, set the gold bead in place, and we're going to be using 0.010 lead wire to lock it in place, along with some thread. For this particular bead size, the 2.8, the 0.010 works well because it tucks inside the bead really nicely and locks it in place. 7 wraps is what I usually use. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. Trim it nice and close. And then pull the bead out just a little bit so you can tuck the lead wire in there with your thumbnail. Push it in place to lock the bead in place, and there you have it. That bead is locked in place. Next, we're going to use some thread. The thread that I use for this particular fly is important to me. It's a gel spun, an 18-aught gel spun thread in a light color, whichever light color you like to use. This one has roughly the same color as the vernal that we're going to be using. Tie in your thread. Leave a very long tag end, which you're going to need, and you'll see why later. Gel spun thread tends to unravel on you, so to prevent that from happening, I like to use some Wonder Wax. You can use any type of wax you like and just give it a quick swipe. Wipe it off with your thumb and forefinger and lock it in place in your material clip. Now go ahead and tie in the lead as tightly as you can tie it in up against the eye of the hook, and if you have any excess, just go ahead and pick it out with your scissors and get it out of the way. So that's the first part of the fly. Now you know you have this thread, bead is nicely locked in place. Tie your thread to the back of the bend of the hook and make sure that your tag end is tied in nice and tight. The next step is going to be to create a trailing shuck. And the way we do that is I take some of the Antron yarn that we used before, and I will pull out some fibers like so. And if you pull them out, you'll find that the fibers taper on their own. You can go ahead and set that in place. Tie it off as close to the front of the hook as you can, and wind it to the back of the hook and let it trail off the back. You are going to want to trim this to about 2 times the length of the shank of the hook or more. And if you can taper it with your scissors, that would be best. Trim off the excess, and let's get ready to do the next step. The next step is going to be to tie in what I call the gas bubble. Now I'll use some of the same Antron yarn as before, but what I'll do is I'll clip it in about 1/4 inch pieces. Just a few pieces is fine. You don't need a lot. Collect them up, and then use your thumb and forefinger to separate all the fibers and blend them all together to create a dubbing. So I don't know if you can see that very well, but that's kind of what it's going to look like. Okay, next I like to use, like I said, Wonder Wax, and I wax my thread really well because we're going to touch dub these fibers on there. So here we go with the touch dubbing. Just touch those fibers on there as gently as you can, and just create a very, very loose dubbing noodle, something like that. Go ahead and wind that on the hook and create your gas bubble all the way to just before the bead. Give yourself some space in the bead to tie off some other materials here in a little bit. Next step would be to tie in the body. Now, like I said, I use a vernil, which is this. This is a small vernil. I actually dye it this color using grit dye, a brown and a yellow combined. You can mess around with whatever colors you like, or you can buy a pre-made earthworm color, I think from the fly shop in Redding, California. You do need a lighter to prepare this material. So you can see that the end of this is really blunt. You want to give it a bit of a taper. And the way to do that is take your trusty lighter. I use a butane cigar lighter, which is a torch type lighter, but you can use any kind you want. Fire it up, get it close to the vernil until it starts to pull back and create a taper just like that. Next, flip it around and measure about 1.5 times to 2 times the length of the gas bubble. So basically you're just going to be about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 past the bend of the hook. Transfer it to your other hand, lock it in place, and give it a good few wraps to hold it there. Trim off your excess as tightly as you can. This is going to be important. And end up with your thread behind. If you leave any extra, it doesn't matter, you can just go ahead and trim it off. Now we're going to use this tag end that we waxed earlier to tie off and lock in place that body. So right now we have a trailing shuck, we have the body, we have a gas bubble underneath, and then we have this trailing, extra tag end. We're going to use that tag end to lock the body in place. So go ahead and pull the body with your left hand. With your right hand, give it 2 wraps around the base like so, just to hold it in place. So now you can see that's nicely in line with the hook shank. Now I like to use a bobbin cradle, and I like to use the rotary function of the vise to do this next step. So I'll give it a few wraps up forward, tie off your tag end with a few wraps, and snip off the excess. Now you can see that this body is nicely tied to the hook. For this next part, I like to use a dubbing teaser. Use your favorite dubbing teaser. This is it. And take the Antron yarn that you put on the bottom for the gas bubble, and you want to tease it out to create a really buggy effect. So we're going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to spin this fly around a couple of times so you can see, and also so I can see. There we go. And just create a very buggy sort of gas bubble effect on the bottom of the fly. So there you have it. So now we have trailing shuck, body, gas bubble. Next step is going to be a little bit tricky. We're going to use a partridge feather to create the soft hackle. The way I do it is by using a Swiss CDC multi-tool. This tool works best for me because it's got a nice sharp swept edge, and I can clamp the fibers of the pheasant tail in there really nicely. So first step is to prepare the feather. To prepare the feather, here's your partridge feather. Strip off this fuzzy stuff at the bottom of the feather because you're not going to be using that. So let's strip that off and get rid of it. So you'd be left with that. Take one side of the feather and separate the fibers and separate the fibers and try to get the tips roughly even. They don't have to be exact, but just roughly. And separate out about a 1/2 to 3/4 inch length of the feather. There you have it. Now, the next step is important because we need to get the length right on this before we clamp it in our CDC clamp. Take your feather, measure to about between the back of the bend of the hook and the end of the body. So we measure that feather right there, hold it in place, take your special CDC clamp and clamp it right where you need it, and go ahead and trim off the excess part of the feather. So once you have those tips in there, clamped in there, you're going to need to put down your CDC multi-tool and create a dubbing loop. The way to do that, obviously, is just create the dubbing loop and tie it in. This next part is very important. What you can see that here we have a gap at the base here. So when we squeeze these fibers together, when we squeeze this thread together, this gap is going to remain. So what we need to do is wrap your thread a couple of times around the base of that and then tie it in. And now you can see that it's going to be super tight and it's going to be able to clamp our feathers in there, clamp those fibers. I put my bobbin in the material in the bobbin cradle. I also use wax on this, a little bit of dubbing wax like we did before, just so that I know that the thread will have a better chance of holding the fibers. Next, I use the Stoneflow Elite dubbing tool, which I can pull tight, and you can see that now we have a nice close tight loop here that we're going to be able to clamp the feathers in. So insert your feathers into that clamp, pull the dubbing tool tight, and very carefully release your clamp. You're going to end up with something that looks like that. So in this case with one finger, spin your dubbing loop until all the fibers separate. And you can see that now all the fibers are separated and they're all clamped in separately. So I use the rotary function of the device to do this next part, just to get it there, and then I'll sweep back the fibers as you tie them in to create a soft hackle. Now, don't worry about tying those fibers back yet. You can do that in just a second with your thread because you're going to be tying your thread back. So release your tool, tie in the thread, and I like to turn it upside down before I snip it just because the thread ended up on the bottom. And go ahead and snip that as close as you can. Now, use your thumb and forefinger to pull those fibers back. If you need the help of your scissors or another tool, you may do that. Go ahead and tie those things so that they're swept back, and also so that you have a gap here between the bead and those fibers. Enough room to tie in a head and the antenna. So there you have it. Your hackle is tied in at a good length. So next step, we're going to take a pheasant tail and we're going to use a couple of fibers from the pheasant tail to tie in the antenna. This it seems like it should be very tricky, but it's not as tricky as it seems. You can very carefully separate two fibers. If you make a mistake and you don't separate two together, you can just pull it off and get rid of it. And then separate two. Now move them to a point where both the ends of the feathers are tight. Clamp it in place with your thumb and forefinger. Trim off the excess. Transfer it to your next hand. Lay your antenna over the fly to about 1.5 to 2 times the length of the fat body. Transfer to your left hand, tie in lightly, and then just cinch into place. And you can see that these feathers spread themselves out on their own once you tie them in. If not, you can just spread them while you're tying them, and you want them to look like so, with a nice V shape. Next, we're going to use another dubbing technique to create a fortified peacock herl head. Now, we know how delicate peacock herl is usually, so we're going to use a technique of spinning the peacock herl in inside some thread to make it really durable. So I'll take the peacock herl, of course, has the butt end and has the tip end. Take the tip end, trim off just a little bit because that tends to be really weak, and then tie in your peacock herl at the tip of your fly. So here's your peacock herl, here's your thread. Now, this part of the dubbing loop is very important. I generally point the fly to where I'm going to be doing this. You don't need to do that. You can just tie it in like this. The dubbing loop that we're going to create is going to be slightly shorter than the length of the peacock herl, and you're going to see that here in a second. You can see that the dubbing loop is created to there, and the reason we do that is because we want to wind the peacock herl around the bottom of the dubbing loop, hold the tag end and spin it just to hold it in place, and then spin the whole feather to create a very strong, tight peacock herl thread. I'll put my bobbin in the bobbin cradle and spin yourself. I like to use the rotary function of the vise. Once again, if you don't have a rotary vise, you can just do it the old-fashioned way. Go ahead and spin a nice head on there for yourself. A few wraps to tie it in place. Trim it off really tight. I'll give yourself a few more wraps just to hold everything in place. Now, instead of using head cement, I like to use Loctite brush-on super glue. It works really well for me, and I love it because it's only a quarter turn. It only takes a quarter turn to remove the cap, so you're not sitting there, threading this thing on and off while you're tying. Brush on about 3/4 of an inch worth onto your thread. Make 3 wraps of that so that they can get in there and tighten up. Use your whip finisher, whip finish off a head, no more than 3 or 4 wraps. Cinch it in place, trim it, and there you have it. The fat butt, my top producing fly of all time. Otherwise known as the maggot by some of my friends, but no less effective. That concludes this fly tying tutorial. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.